This is Keith.
And this is Ben, and this is Main Street Lutherans. Today's topic is, well, it's a continuation of our talk with Dr. Mark Granquist of Luther Seminary, professor of Christian history there at the seminary. We're going to talk about extending from where we left off with our last episode with him. This will cover from the 1800s to about 1930 in America and how those things led toward the ELCA. This time period that we're talking about had a large establishment of Lutheran churches around the country in various parts of the country. We'll talk about not the South in particular, but certainly in the Midwest and in Pennsylvania in particular, and in that middle Atlantic region. So that leads to, we're looking at the 1800s, and when did St. Matthew's open?
1889. Yeah, we started as a Sunday school branch off of another Lutheran congregation not all that far away, 4 big city blocks, which by today's standards seems ridiculous, but at the time it made perfect sense because you were only going to establish a church far enough away for people to, be conveniently able to travel to by horse, by cart, by foot. And so St. Matthew started as a Sunday school, actually branching off, or an outreach ministry really, of Union. I think operated in that vein for a number of years, maybe 20 years. And then they decided to, they had enough momentum to establish it as its own congregation. So 1889 was the official formation of St. Matthew in York.
Wow, so it actually goes back maybe to the 1860s then.
Yeah, which really is like that massive period of expansion where there were, in Pennsylvania anyway, and in central Pennsylvania where York is, there's Lutheran churches all over the place, and many of them started in this vein, sort of as, they sort of springboarded from one to another as time went on.
Yeah, and I guess we should note that York has a very industrial base.
Mm-hmm.
Now a Harley-Davidson manufacturing facility, and York dumbbells or barbells?
Yep,
right.
Yep.
Going back
York
a long
Barbell
time.
was there, the Harley-Davidson plant. And then York was the name of a big name in HVAC products in the, turn of the century, 1900s. So you're talking about, big boilers and then eventually air conditioning units.
Sure.
A lot of that stuff was produced in York. And then York has a big history in World War II in the same vein with plants being repurposed for the war effort.
And I think International Harvester had a plant there too, come to think of it. So
I think they did.
Yeah, so they were big right there at the turn of the 20th century. So
so as the population was growing, then these churches were growing. So, by this point we're talking about immigration already, being firmly established, but population's still shifting and growing.
Sure.
What about Unity, which is a merger congregation?
Yeah. The Synod took 3 congregations and put them together about 10 years ago. I think we had just moved to this area when that had happened, and I wasn't part of any of that. But the congregations that were brought together, and all the congregations really that are in this area, we call it downriver, the part south along the Detroit River from Detroit. I would say most of the ELCA congregations were developed in the 1950s and 1960s, probably to meet the need we'll talk about in the next bit. But it's not just the churches, the suburbs themselves are products of the 50s, 60s, and as you get further out, the 70s, 80s, and then more like today. I'm starting to sound like a radio station here. Yeah, so we'll get into Unity's time in the next talk that we have with Dr. Granquist. But I think coming from I was an architecture tour guide at one point, and if you think about the architecture, Unity's architecture is very much a 60s sort of thing. It's like, compared to St. Matthew's, it's like a ranch.
Mm-hmm.
And yours is more like a farmhouse or some stately sort of place with lots of stairs, which has its pluses and minuses.
Right. Yeah, it is definitely a very sort of colonial style looking facade. Yeah. And even there, that's interesting too, because the current nave was built during the Great Depression. The congregation had outgrown their worship space at that point, and so they had We actually are situated about a block from where the congregation was founded. And as they were growing, they had bought some additional land and then started building on it once they had the money raised. But yeah, so a nave that seats about 600 people, constructed for somewhere in the ballpark of $1 million in the 1930s, with the actual construction happening during the Depression itself. So they were really, really committed to making this happen, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, we are really excited to share this conversation with Dr. Granquist with you. So here we go. Back to talk with us about the history of the ELCA is Dr. Mark Granquist from Luther Seminary, professor of the history of Christianity up at Luther Seminary, up in, I forget, is it St. Paul?
St. Paul, yes.
Yeah, don't mix them up, I found. That's a pretty hard line there. So, yeah. We covered the Reformation up to sort of the immigration to the United States of people from the Lutheran areas. And we want to pick up here about that. The groups that came, we talked a little bit about how they organized into the United States, where they settled, why they settled in those places, and then the difficulties of those folks being Lutheran in a place where religion is voluntary. And so those groups, how did they spread out across the country? I know we've got like Finnish groups in, say, the Upper Peninsula, Michigan and Wisconsin, a lot more Swedes in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and South Dakota, North Dakota. How does that happen from an immigration perspective?
Well, good question. Remember that the second great wave of immigration to the United States begins about 1830, 1840, and runs up through to the beginning of the First World War. All right. This is a period of time in which somewhere between 30 and 35 million Europeans come to North America. And they come in waves. There are push factors. In other words, there are factors that are pushing them out of their home countries. There are pull factors that are pulling them towards. Most of these immigrants are economic immigrants. They're coming for, and remember back for them that the most important thing was land.
And America has a lot of it.
America had, well, yes, once we pushed the Native Americans out, but there just was this hunger, and so they're following the frontier because the land, in central Pennsylvania, the land is all taken by 1800. But if they go out to Indiana or Michigan, there's the frontier keeps moving west, and so it depends on when you come and where the land is at that point in time. By the 1840s, it's Wisconsin and Iowa and Illinois. It's the 1850s and 60s. It's up into Minnesota. It's into Kansas, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota. Then eventually you sort of run out of the good land, and then people have to decide what to do. They want to go to Montana, or they want to go to Washington State. Some of them go to Texas. They're almost none of them going to the South, because the South they have to contend with either slave labor or low-cost labor, and of course after the Civil War, the South is an economic wreck, so they're not going to the South, with the exception of Texas.
And you're not speaking of not Lutherans going to the South. You're talking about not immigrants.
Most immigrants, yeah, most of the immigrants,
by and large, not
right.
journeying to the South at this point. Yeah,
and so the first wave of the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s is heavily German. Starting in the 1850s, then you start getting the Scandinavians coming over, and of course people from Great Britain coming over. Starting in the 1870s, 1880s, you're starting to get the Southern Europeans and the Eastern Europeans, and of course by that time most of the land is gone, and they tend to go to the cities or the mining areas. That's how the Finns end up in in the upper Midwest, in the mining regions in northern Minnesota and northern Michigan, because they're going to where the mining
Copper
operations,
mines in particular, copper and iron, right?
copper and iron, right? So the settlements, and of course then one immigrant finds a good place to settle, and other people, and they send for other people, and they come, and so the immigrants tend to clump. So there's a fascinating map, for example, of the state of Minnesota that shows the clumps of immigrants where they are. So you got the Swedes here and the Finns there, and the Norwegians here, and the Danes and the Germans, and the Bohemians and the Danes and the Dutch and the Irish and all sorts of people like that.
And so the churches begin to clump similarly too. You've got all of these
Exactly.
different Christian traditions
Exactly.
that are coming from different parts of the world and that people are organizing around. And we mentioned in the last episode, you talked a little bit about the Pennsylvania Ministerium
Mhm.
and how that was the first Lutheran body organized, beyond the congregational level. We had this group of pastors and then lay people that were choosing to align with one another for the sake of engaging in things that they couldn't do on their own. You mentioned some mission work, education of pastors, etc. You happened to say in that episode that model was borrowed from the Dutch Reformed tradition, and I'm curious if you could follow up on that just a little bit about where that tradition came from for the Dutch Reformed, and why did the Lutherans use that one?
Well, the Reformed churches were less likely to do these state church things. Now, there is even in places like Scotland, for example, which becomes heavily Calvinist, the Church of Scotland is organized on a Presbyterian or a synodical line.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, their history, because they tend to be less in places where the government is going to sponsor them, and then also there's some theological stuff there. They're thinking about the nature of what it means to be church. They're reacting against the bishops and other sorts of things like that. So it's a model. They get it. Americans get it from the Dutch Reform, the German Reform. They get it from the American Presbyterians. It's one of the three models, and it seems to work very well. Remember, Lutherans have no polity, no polity or church organization that is imposed upon them theologically. Lutherans are kind of pragmatic when it comes to church structures. They will adopt whatever works best in a given situation. So if in Sweden the episcopate works for them, it works, all right? But nobody says that the episcopate is what the nature of the church is. Okay?
So as I take it, then the Episcopal model is another of the three. What's the third one?
Congregational.
Okay.
Just absent. And there are Lutheran groups in the United States that organize on a congregational basis,
Mm-hmm.
both historically and recently.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there's nothing in the Lutheran confessions that says you have to have this model or that model of church organization. People will argue that, but
But it's how we've always done it. Isn't that good enough?
well,
Right.
but it was remember the synodical model also parallels the rise of participatory democracy. In fact, some people will say that that's where it comes from. And so the reinforcement here is that the synodical polity or the Presbyterian polity mirrors the development of American democratic institutions,
Hmm.
right? Where you have everybody in a given body elects representatives, and they go to make decisions for you, and then you come back and then you abide by the decisions, and there's a lot of interplay here. It just seemed it worked out best for the Lutherans that most of them decided that this sort of democratic church polity seemed best.
You reminded me of something I'm a licensed lay minister, so we had a class in our synod about church history, and one of the things that the instructor, he's a professor of history at University of Detroit Mercy, he said that the church tends to choose the government structure they're familiar with when they set up their organizational structure. And I wonder if that plays into
He
it.
said, I mean, think about those countries that had a state church that had a king. The whole idea of somebody at the top, a king being, then you might pick up an episcopacy. That might be seem to be the best model.
Yeah, and I think his point was the Congregationalists would have they were trying to get away from that kingship and try to, we're all responsible for ourselves, so therefore our church will be that way too.
Hmm.
Yeah, so we talked about how the Lutherans or the immigrants of these eras were moving out to the edge, the edge of the frontier, and that part of the existence of the frontier is because people are being moved off of that land. So as we look at our responsibility as a church, we're now recognizing the native populations that were on our property,
Mhm.
that our churches are built on.
Right.
What is did those groups, were they passive in this? Were they pushing for removal of Native Americans from those spaces? We benefited from it certainly,
Yeah.
or those people did anyway.
And
But
we
were
did.
they passive or were they active in that?
They tended to be passive in it. I mean, most of the removals, the pushing of the Native Americans off their lands and into reservations, most of that happened before the immigrants got there. All right. Now, did they benefit from it? Absolutely. Would they be afraid of Native Americans? Possibly. Like I said, it doesn't absolve them of the responsibility that the whole nation shares for this. You can't just say, you know, I didn't come until my ancestors didn't come until 1880, so I'm not responsible for slavery, for example. I mean,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
okay. I mean, it's just, but they weren't active participants in it, really.
And also with slavery then.
Right, exactly.
Since our Lutheran churches avoided the South because land wasn't available,
Mo-
were Lutheran synods, were they outspoken on the issue of slavery leading up to the Civil War, or did they ever take a stand?
Most of them avoided it like the plague. I mean, it's like much in politics, they had managed by 1820, 1830 or so to develop not only synods, but they had a national organization called the General Synod. It had synods it was a synod of synods. It had synods from the Carolinas and Georgia and Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and other kinds of things like that. If you'd have started talking about slavery in the General Synod, you would have blown the whole thing apart.
Hmm.
There were a few synods, and like I said, oftentimes people would split off. There were several synods that were split off specifically to be stronger voices for the abolition of slavery, especially in New York State. But most of the Southern synods, when the war came, the Southern synods supported the Confederacy. No question about it. The Northern synods supported the Union.
Mostly because their kids were fighting?
Uh, well, the Northern Synod started to be able to be more vocal about it because the Southern synods weren't there anymore.
Oh, that would do it.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's easy to be more outspoken when you're surrounded only by more like-minded peoples.
Or when the issue was forced upon you.
Right.
Now, a group like the Missouri Synod, for example, like that in a border state, that was particularly problematic for them because they were right, you know, they were right there in the middle of it and kind of thing like this. But the Scandinavians, especially when they came over, they were very strongly, the Scandinavian synods were very strongly anti-slavery from the beginning. But they didn't have any church congregations in the South anyway, so
So it's easy to take that stand.
well, it was easier.
Easier. Yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of things that get thrust upon folks, industrialization. We reach this industrial age after the Civil War, after when, well, actually a little before too, but the industrialization sort of bringing the populations into cities to do this. Eventually, we'll get the Great Migration up to Detroit and the North for factory work. How does that affect the churches? Especially, we're talking about folks that moved to the United States for land. And now their kids are going in for factory jobs and leaving the farms.
Yeah. Remember that, by 1870s, 1880s, most of the good land was gone. All right. Some of my ancestors arrived in Chicago in the 1880s. All right. They got on the train and went to where there was free land, which was central North Dakota. They lasted 6 months and got on the train and went back to Chicago. And they stayed there ever since. It wasn't just industrialization and the jobs and everything like this, but the increases in agricultural productivity that you need less and less people to actually do the farming. And
Sure.
you've got all these kids and they're all headed to the cities. And so from 1860 to the First World War, you get this, I think I can't remember exactly, but I think sometime by the 1920s, more people are now in cities than are in the rural areas. And of course, that's very different kind of religion work. Now, of course, there's still lots of immigrants speaking immigrant languages in those cities. But increasingly, especially after World War I, the churches are all converting to speaking English. And so you have to do religion quite differently. Now, oftentimes what a lot of these groups tried to do was to replicate small town Christianity in the big cities. I mean, for example, people are wild about this when I tell them that, but this is how the YMCA's got to start. YMCA's, YWCA's, those were supposed to be little havens of small town Protestant respectability in the middle of the big bad cities.
Wow.
Young Men's Christian Association. They don't talk much about that anymore, do they?
No.
It was the YMCA's were one of the leading evangelical in the sense of spreading the gospel around the world.
What denomination were they connected to, or
They were interdenomination. There was no denomination whatsoever. So, anyways, all I'm saying is that this idea is you sort of try to replicate that small town Lutheran ethos in a congregation.
Yeah.
One of the things in the part of the country that I'm in that we face quite a bit is that even just, say where I'm at in the city of York, there are so many Lutheran churches. York is not a very big city. The city limits it's shaped kind of like a big plus sign. It's about 5 miles from east to west and about 4.5 miles from north to south. And except for one, the other 3 corners are all cut out. So it's sort of like a misshapen cross. And, inside that city, there are, I'm not positive, but I think about 8 ELCA Lutheran congregations today.
I wouldn't be surprised.
No. And the notion being, what we were always told was that the congregations were planted, along the route that whatever was considered the longest that you were comfortable riding in your buggy to get to church.
Transportation, yeah. Right.
That's how they were planted. But today, with transportation being so different, that's really shifted.
Yeah, exactly. There's a town just south and east of where I live here. I live just south of the Twin Cities, and there's a little town, very, very Norwegian. I'd say there are probably 10 or 12. It's a town of about 3,000. There are probably in the town and around the town 8 to 10 different Norwegian Lutheran churches.
Yeah.
Sometimes you go to these cities out in the rural area, small towns in the rural areas, and they'll have a Norwegian church on one corner and a Swedish church on the next corner and a German church on the other corner. And, a Danes or Finns or whatever,
Right.
We got an email from a fellow in Iowa who told us about his congregation. It's two separate parishes that the country church decided to evangelize the town, 2 miles away, and so they started a congregation in the town for those folks, town of maybe, I'm guessing 800 people or something like that. And so there are these two congregations that are historically tied together. And so they are operating as one in a way now, but he was talking about that, and that seems like it fits the model.
It does.
Yeah.
So in addition to, we've got these shifting populations, we've got the are there other effects of industrialization on the church, or is it really once we start getting into more of the modern era that church culture begins to tip? And I'm sorry, I may have asked that question really stupidly.
No. I'm just trying to. No. It's a great question. I'm just trying to figure this here. Remember that now I'm not talking about those colonial Lutherans who came and their descendants. They're using English by the 1820s.
Mm-hmm.
But in most of these Midwestern cities, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, St. Louis, Omaha, Fargo, these different Lutheran groups are still using their immigrant language predominantly until the First World War,
Both in church and in daily life?
mainly in church.
Okay.
All right. It becomes, for a lot of them, it becomes a sort of almost a quasi-liturgical language.
Hmm.
It's like the Catholics who used to use Latin, right,
Right.
into the early 1960s, right? My
So
father,
if for example you went to your church service on a Sunday morning, you would speak German or Swedish, and then you go to, say, the fellowship hall to have coffee and donuts afterwards, you would switch to English.
the old people would speak the immigrant language, and the young people would speak English.
Gotcha. Okay.
And it was the generational push
Mm-hmm.
that really won the day in that immigrant language transition. Remember, or very early on, the immigrants are very early on. They learn enough English to get by. They have to, and when
Mm-hmm.
they have their kids educated, they wanted their kids educated in English. No question about that. They weren't stupid. They understood that to get a job and get ahead, the young people needed to use English. But remember that religious language is very high concept language. And you learn enough English to go to the store or to deal with, what the daily things that you need to do. It's
Warms your
hard
heart.
language.
Yeah.
And so there's this there's this there's this there's this sort of tug. Uh, they know, and the younger generations are demanding to worship in English, but the old people, they've got to maintain the language as long as they possibly can. And remember, after World War I, they were fully expecting the immigration to boom back up. Again, remember the height of that great immigration was from 1900 to 1914. It peaked in 1910, 1914. And so in the cities, they still have these little immigrant populations. They're aware of the issues of the larger world around them, but it's not an immediate problem to them. They have problems and issues that they're dealing with of their own. So industrialization, urbanization, I mean, it concentrates people in cities, but it doesn't until they start really using the English and moving into the mainstream of American society. They're not, it's not going to affect them as much.
And to them, evangelism then is trying to make sure their kids go to church when they leave the house, and their neighbors that just moved from, Slovakia or something,
Right,
going to the same.
exactly.
Okay.
I remember one pastor was telling me that he went out into the mission field, into the home mission field in Oregon in the 1950s. And he said, the first thing I did is I got the phone book and I looked up everybody's last name that looked to be German.
Mhm.
It reminds me of there's a Northern Exposure episode where they're trying to get the doctor. He wants to say wants to do the memorial rites for his, I think, for a rabbi, and they look through the phone books for all the Jewish sounding names in Alaska, right? Trying to pay them to come and sit Kaddish
Yes.
for them. So yeah, it reminds me of that quite a bit.
Yeah.
And it worked. All right.
Mhm.
Lutheranism grew. By 1900, Lutheranism was the third largest Protestant group in the United States, after the Methodists and the Baptists, and behind the Catholics. It was the Catholics, then the Baptists and the Methodists, then the Lutherans. There were more Lutherans. There were more Lutherans than Presbyterians. There were more Lutherans than Episcopalians. There were more Lutherans than, some of these many of these other groups. It worked.
But the
Now-
Baptists and the Methodists were less ethnic, right?
Yeah.
They were more American.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, there were all sorts of ethnic
Yeah.
divisions of both, but
Sure.
mainly.
Yeah.
Mark, I'm
So-
curious if at this time, you mentioned the shifting of population from country to city. Was in these synods, which I understand are still somewhat loose in this part of history, was there tension between, the synods affiliated with, sort of rural communities versus synods affiliated in more urban areas? Or did they just, each have their own territory, or were there synods that incorporated congregations from both kinds of setting?
Well, I mean, of course, there were, like I talked about before, synods of synods or national church organizations, right?
Mhm.
And so there were several in the East Coast. The Missouri Synod was growing into that. The larger of the Scandinavian groups were, were including congregations from around the country. So they would have both rural and urban kinds of things like that. I don't know that there was a lot of tension that way between rural and urban.
Mhm.
They tended all to share the same values, the same ethos. Now, the congregations in the cities might be, I don't know, they might be more affected by some of the things that are going on in American society, but not really. I mean,
Okay.
the divisions tended to be ethnic and theological.
Okay. So when you said that as people started moving into cities and being church in the city environment was different than being church in the country, it wasn't to the point where those two folks weren't speaking the same language, metaphorically, not literally.
No,
Sometimes literally.
Okay.
no.
Okay.
You will find what you will find in the urban areas. The urban areas will be the pioneers of, say, what sometimes are known as English churches.
Okay.
And so in the cities, you would have a group, say that there was a congregation in the city, and then there was a group from that congregation that wanted to have an English speaking congregation. They'd split off and form an English congregation.
Yep. I remember
That was
in
the major
Columbus.
split.
Yeah.
That would
There
have
was the
been
first
split.
English Lutheran church in Columbus when Ben and I were there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But would they consider themselves still equally Lutheran? Would they still maintain their presence in a synod?
Yeah.
You would have some English and some German speaking, or
Right.
Swedish, or
Right.
yeah.
Remember, it was the speed of that transition after the First World War, which really sort of caught everybody by surprise. There was some conflict. There was obviously some conflict. It was a very emotional issue, but it happened so quickly.
Hmm.
And it was sort of a generational wave that all of a sudden.
When you said that in the colonial times that only about 20% of the population belonged to a church,
Right.
where are we at with that at the turn of the century?
About half.
Okay.
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 About 50%. So there is a strong push towards religiosity that peaks by about 1965 or so.
Hmm.
And from 1965 to the end of the 20th century, it plateaus at about two-thirds. About
Yeah.
two-thirds of Americans belonged to a church.
Yeah. And I remember hearing somebody speak a couple of years ago. I can't recall the individual's name, but he said that, what you were mentioning in our last episode, the golden age that people were always trying to get back to. In our part of the country, people talk about the golden age of being in the kind of the 1950s and 60s. And they have this image that that's how the church was from, the establishment of the United States of America until the end of World War II. And then it began to fall apart. But really, that was, as you just said, that was the peak. That's what people were trying to get back to, but it wasn't always like that leading up to that point.
It was not always like that. People think that back in that the peak of American religiosity, by mean religiosity of people going to church and having church membership and the kinds of things like that, that there's a steady growth of that kind of religiosity from about 15 to 20% in the colonial period of time to the late 1960s when it peaks at about 65%. All right. And then it plateaus for a long time. Now we can talk about there's lots of caveats to that and everything else like that. But yeah, I mean, the growth of organized Christianity is steady from the colonial period of time through the late 1960s.
So then with the end of the First World War and all the things that are happening with society, science is becoming a thing, and we're looking at the world a little differently. We get the introduction of modernity with things like I'll keep going back to working at Greenfield Village because I work at the Wright Brothers home where Milton Wright was a bishop in the United Brethren Church and led a schism there in York, Pennsylvania in 1889. And the introduction of these new modern ways of looking at the world that come from Enlightenment and that, but we think of the search for the historical Jesus and the introduction of the historical critical method of looking at the Bible, and then the opposition to that. So we get the modernists and the fundamentalists, and they come to or almost come to blows. Maybe probably did come to blows in some cases.
Yes, they did.
Most I think of it as in the maybe mid to late 1920s that happens.
Right. Yeah. It's affecting the old stock Protestant mainline churches, especially the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Northern Baptists the most.
Yeah. So it would seem like the Lutherans would get hit by this too.
No.
Why not?
They're aware of these things. They're certainly aware of these things, but that's not what they're fighting. They're fighting about confessional issues. They're fighting about the 16th century Lutheran confessions and how to understand them. They know what's going on, and they're not stupid. They know what's going on in the modern world, but it's not their universe. All right.
Are they kind of
They're
denying
neither
the
they're
modern
neither
world?
fundamentalist or modernist.
So is it because there's a spectrum? Or
Well,
is it because they're
but
just removing
because
themselves from the conversation?
most Christians weren't either fundamentalist or modernist. Those were just fringes.
Okay.
All right. It takes a long time for a lot of that stuff to sort of gradually move into the churches by the 60s and 70s. And I talk about tell my students about the unholy trinity. All right.
Okay.
Darwin, Marx, and Freud.
Okay.
The three horsemen of what you might call modernity.
Sure.
And these are not. I mean, the leaders of the Lutheran churches know about these people. They're not dumb, but it's not their world. They're not fighting about these things. The Lutherans are all talking about, well, now that now that we all speak English, what do we do? And so we get these three major waves of merger. But and occasionally Lutherans will borrow language like inerrancy or infallibility, but they're not fundamentalists. They think that those words in see, because all right, when the Lutherans start speaking English, they've got to start doing theology in English,
Right.
which is tough because Lutheran theology hadn't really ever been done in English. And and what words in English mean what you think. So they Lutherans have a concept, for example, of biblical authority. Well, how do you express the Lutheran concept of biblical authority in English? Some use language that they borrowed from the fundamentalists, but they don't mean the same thing.
Mm.
So it's not really until after World War II and when the Lutherans are really moving in the 50s and 60s into the real mainstream of American life that these issues of modernism and other sorts of things like this become really important in American Lutheran life.
And then all at once, it seems.
And then all at once, right?
Yeah. Huh. Well, that
Yeah.
is very interesting. Is there a corollary to Europe? What did the European Lutheran Church do? Was it dictated from on high? I mean, was it still did the government choose the well, I guess they're thinking in German. So they don't need to deal with how Americans look at these things, right?
Well, but they've gone through this earlier. I mean,
Yeah.
see, remember, since most of the Lutheran clergy are trained in the universities, then in the Enlightenment, as the German universities are moving in ways, they're not really modernist in the late 19th, 20th century, but they're moving in historical critical method and other sorts of things like that. So it's coming very differently. It's coming in theological education in the 1840s or 1860s or 1880s or something like that.
So it's almost the reverse then. In Europe, you've got the theological, educational, academic circles are shifting ahead of,
The
the
laity.
Oh yeah.
and the science and the modernism. In the US, you've got the reverse. It's the modernism is going on and people are learning about science and Darwin and Freud, and then the theological community almost has to play catch up to it.
Yeah, I that might be a way of looking at it. Yeah.
If your name is Keith.
Well, yeah, I mean, what happens is in the 1950s and 1960s, then um, a lot of bright American Lutherans are going over to Germany and Scandinavia and getting doctorates there. And then they're starting to bring some of that stuff back, or they're learning it and at places like Harvard or Yale or Union or other sorts of places like that, and Chicago, and bringing it into theological education then. But
Hmm. Okay, that makes sense.
So what would a layperson in Lutheran America think of something like the Scopes monkey trial, where they're trying to put Darwin's, theory of well, they try to put evolution on trial, right? What would an American Lutheran response to that be? Was it just silly?
I think remember the whole question is the question of God. Is God at work in the world? Does God cause things to happen? Evolution basically says, you know, it's random chance, there's no God, kind of thing like that. I'd say 99 out of 100 Lutherans would have completely rejected that idea that God was not involved in the world.
So they wouldn't have thought that God was involved in the evolutionary process.
Some might have.
Hmm.
But it might take some creativity to get there.
They might say, well, there was this sort of line that evolution is God's way of doing things, which completely misunderstands evolution.
Right.
Right.
And probably God. Okay. And so that explains why Lutherans didn't schism when these other churches did.
It wasn't their issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And that leaves the schism for our next talk that we'll do,
Oh, yes.
which that'll be the adventurous part of Lutheranism in America, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. Yeah. That combined pattern of combining synods and coming together at the same time as we start then peeling apart too.
Yeah.
A pattern that still continues today. All right.
Absolutely.
Well, Mark, thank you again so much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you very much for the good questions and for listening to me.
Yeah, this has been enlightening, and I think it'll be very helpful to folks trying to figure out, where do we exist in this historical timeline of Christianity here. So, all right. Well, I look forward to our next talk.
So if you want to, I will say that if you want to learn more about this, I wrote the book.
All right, and we'll have a link to that in our
It's
notes.
called Lutherans in America: A New History. So you can pick that up wherever you pick up your fine theological reading.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely have links to that. All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
Well, that was really something. It's such a privilege to be able to talk with Dr. Mark Granquist from Luther Seminary about the history of our denomination, how we get to where we're at. It's amazing how much the influence of world events, immigration trends and things, even after they get to the United States, how that affects who we become as a denomination. And we'll have even more of that in our next talk with Dr. Granquist.
Yeah, looking forward to that.
He mentions his book. We have links to his book and other information connected to this episode in our episode notes. Our catechism questions for today. Our last episode, now we didn't get any responses from our last episode yet. Send them in.
That means there's still time for you to reply.
That's right. But our most recent question was, what do most Lutherans consider to be the greatest of God's gifts? We had answers of the created world, coffee. Keith is really leaning hard on that one. The Holy Bible. And then we have the grace of God through the life, death, and resurrection. It's scrolled off my page here. Of Jesus Christ, which is available to us by faith. And of course, that is the correct answer there. So, yeah, we've got a new catechism question. Amazing that we have another one.
Yes, indeed. We keep coming up with them. This episode, again, kind of leaning into the topic that we heard from Dr. Granquist on. The question for this week is, where did the majority of Lutherans immigrate to North America from? And this is in that 1800s time period. So where did the majority of Lutherans immigrate to North America from? Your answers are Germany, Norway, and Sweden, Germany, Norway, and France, Austria, Australia, and Antarctica, or Wittenberg, Wartburg, and St. Olaf. And Ben will tell you how to respond in just a moment.
Absolutely, because Main Street Lutherans is hosted by Keith Fair and Ben Fote. You can reach us by email at mainstreetlutherans@gmail.com, so go ahead and send your answers to that if it's easy. Our website is mainstreetlutherans.com. We're also on the socials as Main Street Lutherans on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube. You can also call to leave us a message at area code 734-250-9554. That is in the episode notes as well. The show is produced by Folk Media Productions. And until next time, go in peace, serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.